see a really good turnout, and as Claire said, very good to see, you know, PhD community past and present here united, which is great, and I think a good vote of confidence for intergenerational, interdepartmental kind of collegial support for the current cohort, which is very, very nice to see. Thank you very much for joining us. Good evening. I hope everyone's keeping safe and well amidst yet another lockdown. Just a few things really before starting and sort of introducing our two speakers. So Katie unfortunately can't join us today, but Joseph and Verity are here to share their research with us. And I'll say a little bit more about them in a moment or two. But just a few things before, in case you're not really familiar with the Zoom format. I'm sure many people are by now. It seems to become accepted really quickly, but just if not, there's a few things that I think generally tend to help Zoom meetings go a little bit better if everyone does. The first thing I find with Zoom, generally speaking, and I know some people already heard me say this, so apologies for the repetition to some, but if you've just turned up or come in the last couple of minutes, it does sometimes seem to be the case if there are kind of audio or technical issues with Zoom, it's better to have not lots and lots of cameras on at once. So if you're not one of the speakers, I would request, if you don't mind, maybe putting your camera off and maybe putting yourself on mute. And if you put the camera off on mute, for the majority of the speakers like talking and also the questions afterwards, it might help the connectivity issues if we get any. We might not. Of course, if you want to ask a question and speak to people, it's lovely to see you. So you might then want to turn your camera on, as well as, of course, unmuting yourself. The other thing I think is worth saying as well is, in terms of giving me the questions, I'm sharing it. Maybe if you can put in the chat and just make sure the question's addressed to everyone rather than a particular person, therefore I as chair will see it, that'd be very good. It's quite easy just to see at the bottom. If you've got the chat function on Zoom, you can see it's in the bottom of the screen. In the middle, there's like a little speech bubble. And if you click, just make sure it's set to everyone if you type out a question. Anytime you want to write a question in, feel free to do so. I'm going to be monitoring the chat throughout the evening. So hopefully nothing will get past me. You know, if something interesting occurs to you 5 minutes into the talk, do feel free to write it down and we can return to it at the end. And yeah, what I'm going to try to do is maybe going to hear both people speak and then we'll move on to your questions at the end. Maybe if you want like point of fact type questions, maybe, or if you think they're going to be quite quick, maybe we can go to those just after the speaker. But most of the kind of the detailed questions where we're going to talk and discuss, maybe leave those at the end. So that's kind of how I envisage it working. I'll pick up your questions at the end. So I just want to say a little bit about who's here and who's going to be speaking to us tonight. So we've got two speakers today. The first speaker is Verity Steele. And I'm just going to read out some information that Verity sent us just by way of introduction. So Verity, in 1987, then a classically trained musician, answered an advert in a German music magazine for a position as a violinist with the Kibbutz Chamber Orchestra of Israel. The opportunities this afforded was life-changing. Not only did she get to know a number of Holocaust survivors and learn for the first time a little about the British Mandate, but the acceptance of a lift one night during the first Intifada brought to light, courtesy of the driver, the past existence for Jewish Hakshara training farm just across the fields from her childhood home near Faxted in Essex. Many years later, having completed an MRes at the Institute of Historical Research, she is continuing her journey of discovery, now in the final year of a PhD under Professors Tony Kushner and Joachim Schleur at the University of Southampton. And then we're going to hear from Joseph Finlay, who's also, of course, at the University of Southampton, a doctoral student. Joseph's research focuses on Jewish identity and the concept of race in post-war Britain, considering the tensions and interplay between Jewish and non-Jewish communities. So we've got two very interesting sounding talks today. We're going to hear from Joseph in a bit on Jewish responses to race and racism in post-war Britain. And before that, we're going to hear from Verity on saving Jewish souls for a future Jewish state, competition, compromise and cooperation in refugee rescue.
Good evening, and thank you for your interest in our PhD research here at Southampton. Before I begin my presentation, I just need to say a few words about my methodology and the implications for disseminating research in this brave new world of Zoom and YouTube. During the course of my research into the Bachad movement, I've had the privilege of meeting a number of former Bachad members or their relatives. Many have generously given up time to be interviewed, and others have provided material in various forms. You'll appreciate that great sensitivity is needed when using this kind of material. If it's misused or misrepresented, especially in the online environment, there is potential to cause distress to those who have given over information in good faith. So with this in mind, and to facilitate the uploading of this recording to YouTube, I've sought and obtained the approval of those who have a personal connection to the material I've used, and I'm re-recording it with minor alterations. I'm also aware of the possibility that such a presentation might limit or dictate in some way the course of interviews I might conduct in the future. So I'd like to stress that this talk should be viewed simply as an introduction to the contextual background of my research, and that my completed thesis will take a far more analytical, theoretically based approach than the outline you're about to see. But there may be others watching who would like to contribute some information. If so, I'd be more than happy to hear from you using the email on the screen. It'll also pop up at the end of this presentation. Those of you living abroad may not have heard of the British TV series, I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. Prior to 2020, this involved a group of so-called celebrities being whisked off to some far-flung island or jungle, where they would spend a number of weeks being tested in various ways, and at the end a winner would be crowned. But last year, due to the pandemic, the TV company had to settle for a venue in the UK. This impressive-looking castle in North Wales, Grych Castle, was their eventual choice. This decision provoked a number of articles in the press. One especially expressed concern that this entertainment, and if you watched it, you would have seen various trials involving cockroaches, frogs, and snakes, that it would trivialize a far more significant and dark episode in the castle's past. And it's this particular past which is connected to my research. So let me introduce you to one of the castle's former inhabitants, the very experienced, highly trained, capable and charismatic Erwin Seligman, who was in charge of the castle from late August 39 till 41, in his capacity as a leader of the pioneering organization he had belonged to in Germany, Brit Chalutzim Dati'im, the Alliance of Religious Pioneers, or Bachad for short. I first encountered Erwin in the archives, as it were, but had the privilege of meeting his daughter, Hannah, a few years ago. She kindly gave me a collection of papers in modern Hebrew about her father, but made it clear that she expected me to do my bit by including her father's story in my research. I'll not forget the couple of hours she spent chatting with me and the warmth and enthusiasm with which she recalled her father and his work. My subsequent email contact with her was sadly cut short due to her falling seriously ill, and tragically she passed away last year. So I'd like to dedicate this presentation to her memory, and in line with her wishes, the memory of her father, a little of whose work within Bachad I will now share. Born in Hamburg in 1909, Erwin's Orthodox, established German Jewish family background ensured him a solid Jewish education. His particular stream of orthodoxy was marked by its openness to the modern world, and it was through Erwin's contact with the famous Rabbi Carlebach that his eyes were opened to the Zohar, part of the Kabbalah, and also to the world of the arts, the study of which he would later pursue professionally. In Germany during the 20s and 30s, there were a range of Jewish youth movements, a minority which catered for religious youth. Youngsters would meet at least once a week, sing songs, receive instruction, and go on camping expeditions together. In his youth, Erwin belonged to a number of these, and early on displayed leadership skills. Here he is at age 18, leading a small group of youngsters for the youth movement Ezra. This was a religious group, but less Zionist than Bachad. Erwin also joined Seirei Mizrahi, Brit Chalutzim, and finally Bachad. And it was these involvements that were to play a decisive role in his life. Bachad, a professionally serious and adult group, had been founded in Germany in 1928 as a specifically religious pioneering movement, dedicated to training and then sending its members on Aliyah, emigration to Palestine, or Eretz Israel as they called it, then under the British mandate. Bachad established a number of farms for hachshara, which is Hebrew for preparation. As well as agriculture, Bachad trainees studied everything they would need for their future life in Palestine: Bible and Talmud, Jewish history, modern Hebrew, and most importantly, local knowledge of their intended destination. Erwin became a Bachad leader, a madrich, or instructor, at both of Bachad's main agricultural centres, Steckelsdorf and Geringshof, in addition to running a Beit Chalutz, or pioneer house, in Hamburg, and working at Bachad's HQ in Berlin. But Bachad was a small movement with few resources. The situation in 1930s Germany didn't allow it exactly to pursue its own path entirely as it would have liked. In addition, Bachad found itself in competition with a far larger, better financed but less religious movement, Hey Chalutz. Hey Chalutz, which means the pioneer, predated Bachad by some 6 years and had become the umbrella movement for pioneering youth. It was also the main contact point with the Reichsvertretung, the official body representing Jewry within the Third Reich. It was the Reichsvertretung who received funds from abroad, including from the Council of German Jewry here in the UK, some of which was specifically earmarked for agricultural training in Germany. The German Zionist Federation and Hey Chalutz were the chief distributors of this funding. But other matters were of deeper concern to Bachad. It was afraid of religious youth being sucked into these more secular movements and being lost to Judaism. This issue was the subject of ongoing debate within Bachad and also with Hey Chalutz, which in the end resulted in a degree of cooperation between them. Bachad was given its own desk in the Hey Chalutz offices in Berlin and was allowed to handle all religious concerns. It was hoping to have an influence from within. The numbers of youth wanting to join Bachad, and indeed all youth movements, grew exponentially during the 30s, especially after the Nazis came to power. but the flow of trainees going on Aliyah was vastly reduced due to British policies in Palestine. Backlogs resulted, not only for Aliyah, but also for places on the farms. New routes had to be found. This harsh reality validated another approach, that of the recently created Youth Aliyah organization founded by Recha Fryer, whose target group was 14 to 17-year-olds. Youth Aliyah were keen to partner with Bachad, so Bachad leaders like Erwin were recruited to work for Youth Aliyah in tandem with their own Bachad work. Bachad was given a desk as well in the Youth Aliyah office in Berlin, in effect turning it into the religious wing of Youth Aliyah. The boundaries between these different groups were often fluid. In 1936 and also in 1938, Erwin worked at the Hey Chalutz Center at Blankenese, and here we see him leading a Youth Aliyah group at Rudnitz. But despite this outward blurring of boundaries, Bachad's own documentation demonstrates a firm sense of autonomous identity, which it promoted through a constant stream of newsletters, a journal, Chayenu, through the Jewish press, and by publishing educational material. As the grip of Nazism tightened, Bachad, like other movements, expanded its work to other European countries. The resultant transnational networks were to become increasingly important for rescuing Jewish lives. As day-to-day life became more and more difficult, Bachad's leadership team needed to travel to its centres to troubleshoot problems, for which, surprisingly, the Gestapo issued them with special passports. However, the general restrictions affecting the movement of Jews at this time affected another important aspect of Bachad's work, that of sending fully trained Bachad members from Palestine back to Germany as shlichim, emissaries, to mentor the younger groups. But by 1935, this had become impossible. But Bachad leaders with these special Gestapo-issued passports were permitted to travel under strict conditions, of course. There were networking trips to Palestine and in 1935 to the UK, where Bachad leader Aryeh Handler visited influential figures in the Jewish community, including many of those who saw themselves as part of the wider family of the Mizrahi or Torah Va'avodah organizations. As the situation in Europe deteriorated further, Austria and Czechoslovakia were added to the list of destinations, often at great risk. In fact, Erwin was himself sent to Czechoslovakia in 1936. Life was intense and pleas for rescue were increasing on an almost daily basis. The events of Kristallnacht, 9th and 10th of November 1938, were to change Bachad's course permanently. In response to the British government's decision to allow up to 10,000 unaccompanied children into the UK, Bachad set to work, especially in conjunction with Youth Aliyah, to organize the transport of as many of its members as possible. In May 1939, Erwin was selected by Youth Aliyah to accompany a group of children on their journey to the UK. His first stop was Whittingham Farm School in the Scottish borders, the former estate of Lord Balfour. Then he was sent down to Kent to Great Engham Farm. He took up leadership roles in both these places, becoming a father figure and mentor to many. And finally, in August 39, he escorted a group of children to the now infamous Grych Castle, then a derelict wreck without running water, proper sanitation, electricity or heating. Here's a photo of what greeted them on their arrival. As if these initial shocks, physical hardships and family separations weren't enough, the outbreak of war on the 3rd of September brought with it the prospect of a bleak, uncertain future. Erwin, in his position as manager of the Grych Castle Hachshara, along with the rest of his team, which interestingly included instructors from Hey Chalutz, or Habonim as it became in the UK, set about creating a structured program of work, study and communal worship. This renewed partnership with Hey Chalutz was not without its difficulties, especially as a proportion of the refugees were not from religious homes. Bachad's desire to make Gwych Castle kosher, as it were, meant that everybody at the castle had to live by Bachad's rules to a large degree. In 1941, the youth at Grych and their leaders were asked to move on. They split off in many directions, but a proportion were sent by Bachad to its smaller Hachshara bases, little more than hostels in reality, but which Bachad insisted on calling kibbutzim. The chief of these was kibbutz Shivat Zion at Bromsgrove, where Erwin would later take charge. Going on Aliyah was impossible during the war, and even after the war, Bachad had difficulty obtaining anything like the number of legal certificates it needed for Palestine. The situation was also exacerbated by the arrival of refugees from the camps. But as a number of Bachad members by this time had joined the Jewish Brigade or had gone to the continent to assist with relief work, a little bit more space was available. It was these latter involvements that provided the cover for Bachad's involvement in illegal Aliyah activities, or Aliyah Bet. Some Bachad members were unfortunately intercepted by the British Navy and interned in camps in Cyprus for a year. Erwin, however, managed to get to Palestine legally in 1946. One can only imagine what it was like for these young refugees at Grych to spend the war in Britain, not knowing the fate of their parents or siblings. But here, Bachad's training farms played an important role. These youngsters were all in the same boat, and taking pride in useful work and having the necessities of life provided within a communal setting was by and large helpful. Tragically, most would never see their families again. The majority of the former Bachad members I've met look back on their time on Hachshara with nostalgia and gratitude. Most felt as if they had been adopted into a new family, and a number continued with communal living by joining religious kibbutzim in Palestine, later Israel. However, Erwin chose not to join a kibbutz, but settled independently, resuming his profession as a successful artist and educator. Erwin's journey is but one of many I could have chosen to illustrate the organizational backdrop to my thesis. Without a published history of the movement and little reference to it in the literature, there has been much in the way of basic historical reconstruction work to be done through a wide variety of sources before I could even think of applying any model of analysis. For me, the route into this history came through its location, as I grew up just a few fields away from Bachad's largest training farm at Thaxted, Essex. But that's a story of its own. Whilst location is important and indeed was significant for these refugees, their goals were achieved in practice through the workings of a far wider transnational group of networks and activities than most of them were even aware of. Evidence of these networks and the transfer of both personnel and ideas is to be found in the archives, and thankfully I was able to collect a lot of sources prior to the pandemic. The themes of competition and compromise with Hey Chalutz continue to crop up. A few examples to illustrate this are seen firstly in correspondence dating from 1939, where, according to Bachad's director in London, Aryeh Handler, Hey Chalutz had noticed how effective Bachad were becoming, and in Handler's opinion, were doing their utmost to keep Bachad as small as possible by withholding funds. Again, Hey Chalutz held the purse strings, and by not allocating Bachad its agreed percentage of the Aliyah certificates. Also of interest is that through the 40s, both movements were actively supporting the setting up of new youth groups to be feeders for their training centres. For Bachad, this was Bnei Akiva, and for Hey Chalutz, Habonim. Another more strictly Orthodox but not so Zionist movement was also on the scene, the Agudah. Early in 1946, a Habonim leader, writing in a very friendly tone to a Bachad work colleague, wrote, "I hear that Agudah makes your task rather difficult by offering a high compensation, presumably monetary, for each page of Gemara gone through. So few souls for so many parties. Can you advise me, my dear friend, whom am I to be sorry for, the souls or the parties?" There was, of course, much more to Bachad than religiously or financially motivated competition. I haven't even touched on its political involvements, socialism, or what happened later on. But my thesis, as well as tracing the development of Bachad's ideology and its legacy, will seek to draw from the many strands of its history its points of tension, particularly the pull between the transnational and the diasporic, the local versus the global, whilst at the same time telling this hitherto undocumented history, a history which sheds further light on, amongst other things, Britain's Jewish refugee history and Bachad's role in it. It's interesting also that after all these years, some of the few surviving former residents of Gwych Castle still want to go back. Rabbi Professor Daniel Sperber was actually born in the castle in 1940, where his father, Shmuel, was employed as rabbi. In 2019, Rabbi Daniel made the journey from Israel back to North Wales with his son. This perhaps underlines the assertion that the local still has a global pull. I conclude with a final word from Erwin Seligman, written on the occasion of the first anniversary of their stay at the castle. Roughly paraphrased from the German, he challenges the youngsters to consider the following: that working amongst the beauty of the natural environment was a transformative experience, and that this, in conjunction with surmounting the challenges of their present situation, would bring forth the maturity needed for life in Eretz Yisrael. And finally, that commitment to each other in their communal life was providing them with the ability to create real atmosphere, enabling them to not even notice that the castle didn't feel like home. This, he considers, is their strength. There is no doubt in my mind that Bachad, and particularly those caring leaders like Erwin, not only saved many lives by facilitating journeys of children from Nazi Europe to the UK, but gave them hope and confidence to face the future with courage, wherever that would be. As for Erwin himself, his unstinting commitment and service inspired many of the refugees, leading to the conclusion which Hannah, his daughter, emphasized, that he was indeed the right man in the right place at the right time.
Hi, everybody. Hope you can hear me properly.
Yeah.
It's lovely to see you all. Thanks so much for coming this evening. We really appreciate it. And many thanks to the Parks Institute for organising this talk. Parks Institute is a really fantastic community of scholars, which is really invaluable for doing research into this broad world, Jewish, non-Jewish relations, which is the title of the Institute. So I'm going to be focusing on a part of my PhD research. Like many PhDs, on the face of it, it's something very niche, something about post-war British Jews and race, but like all PhD topics, the niche tends to expand once under the microscope, once you start looking at it closely. So this is a small part of my research. So I'm going to also screen share my not as beautiful as Verity, my presentation, but hopefully useful nonetheless. In the 1950s, British Jews began to become ordinary. The events of the past 2 decades, which had kept Jews in the news and thus emphasized Jewish difference, were past. The war was over. Israel had independence and was no longer a cause of conflict between Britain and Jews. Fascism had been largely driven underground, and British society was, on the whole, happy for Jews to integrate or assimilate. The interwar move to the suburbs, and here's a picture of Gants Hill, continued apace, given new impetus by the wartime bombing of the inner cities, and becoming suburban was an effective way to evade ethnic difference and achieve ordinariness. The 1944 Education Act granted the Jewish baby boomers greater educational opportunities, and 1950s economic growth helped a growing number of Jews join the burgeoning British middle class. Negative attitudes to Jews did not disappear overnight, but the institutions actively discriminating against Jews were now an elite few. A sign of newfound Jewish self-confidence was the prominence of a group of writers, the so-called angry young men of British Jewry, who turned their focus inward, criticising British Jewish culture for what they saw as its emptiness and materialism. A prominent example was Brian Glanville and his 1958 novel The Bankrupts, depicting a young daughter's rebellion against her Hampstead nouveau riche family. Its heroine, Rosemary Friedman, does not wish to abandon Jewishness altogether, but instead finds a Jewish partner in Bernard Carter, who rejects the stifling world of North London weddings and Bournemouth dances, instead seeking a bohemian and cosmopolitan life in London and in Israel. Highly recommended if you haven't read it. Just as Jews were beginning to fade into the background, British society was developing new fears of difference. Immigration from the new Commonwealth had proceeded apace since the late 1940s, but gained new prominence in the national debate following the Notting Hill riots of 1958 and the restrictive 1962 Commonwealth Immigrants Act. This period marked the start of the so-called race relations era, as questions of race became extensively discussed in Parliament, in public debates, in new organisations, and most popularly, in television sitcoms. My research asks what role British Jews played in the era of race relations. How did Jews, as Jews, interact with this new world in which other minorities were the subject of intense debate and prejudice? Was there any equivalent to the famed Black-Jewish alliance of the United States? And how did Jewish involvement in the politics of race impact on Jewish self-identification? As the race relations era took shape in the late 1950s and early 60s, Jewish organisations such as the Board of Deputies, Chief Rabbinate, and Anglo-Jewish Association had little to say about it. Instead, Jewish interventions were made by a handful of progressive individuals. Today I'm going to give 3 examples. The first is the German Jewish urban sociologist Ruth Glass, who, together with the later Stone-born Jew Harold Pollins, published The Newcomers, a study of West Indians in London. It combined sociological research with analysis of racial discrimination and was unusual in the way it drew connections between anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism, such as housing adverts which specified no coloureds, English only. And the English only was designed, Glass and Pollins suggested, to rule out Jews as well as Black people. Another individual activist was the lawyer Anthony Lester, recently deceased, who, in combination with a number of Jewish colleagues in the Society of Labour Lawyers, was highly influential in drafting the 1965 Race Relations Act. Lester would later reflect on the reasons for his anti-racist activism, ascribing it in part to his grandparents having been refugees from Tsarist Russia, to having escaped Nazism due to being born in England, and to his experiences of anti-Semitism while doing national service in Suez and while a student at Cambridge. A final figure is the novelist Alexander Baron, whose 1963 novel The Lowlife was one of the first post-war British novels to include Black characters. The West Indian D'Souza family move into one of the rooms in the Hackney slum house where the novel's anti-hero, the arch-gambler Harry Boy Boaz, resides. In contrast to the non-Jewish and socially ambitious neighbour Evelyn, Harry Boy gets on well with the D'Souzas and articulates a shared Black and Jewish experience of persecution to explain why they get on so well. Over a meal, "You see," I said, "the way we eat, the way we live. You and me, Joe, we mop the plate dry. We suck the last gob of marrow. We lick our fingers. From our fathers and our grandfathers we know hunger and we value food. In our blood we know that an axe can fall on us at any second. So we live. We live." In contrast to these individuals, the institutions of organised British Jewry kept remarkably quiet on these issues. It was not until the late 1960s that a substantial intervention was made, and this intervention will be the focus of the remainder of my talk. In 1968, recently installed Chief Rabbi Emanuel Jacobowitz invited a number of prominent Jewish figures, both religious and secular, to a conference on race relations. Jacobowitz spoke of 3 possible causes for anxiety, as he put it: a concern for the welfare of coloured immigrants, a concern that hostility towards coloured immigrants might lead to increased anti-Semitism, and disaffection of Jewish young people due to the failures of the Jewish community to emphasise moral protest and social action. So I think it's interesting that 2 of his 3 causes are kind of internally focused, focusing on Jewish continuity, on anti-Semitism, and this desire to keep young people in the fold by having some sort of moral purpose. Responses to his call were informative. Social psychologist and German Jewish emigre Hilda Himmelwhite argued that Jews, as part of their moral doctrine, must also be seen to do all in their power to condemn racial intolerance and do all they can to ensure that they themselves indicate by their actions that they will have no part in discrimination. Anthony Lester, who we previously mentioned, complained bitterly at the failure of British Jewish organisations to follow their American counterparts in taking an active role in the fight for racial justice. Lester ascribed this British Jewish passivity to a fear of Jews becoming racialised once again. He said, "I characterise a large element in the response of our community towards the mounting racism against coloured people as one of relief that a new target has been set up in Britain. And there is considerable reluctance because of prejudice and social conformity to tackle the problem of colour, for fear that the participants should themselves be identified yet again as a separate minority." His point was echoed and made even more explicit by Sidney Bunt of the Association for Jewish Youth, who said, "Any overt support by Jews for coloured communities may well bring Jews back into the front line of hostilities, a position which we have not occupied since the coloured immigrants inherited it about 20 years ago." To the annoyance of Rabbi Jacobowitz, the Board of Deputies took over the project, sending out questions to synagogues and other Jewish community organisations, asking what action they took in the field of race relations. Only around 5% were returned, showing that it was not a high priority for most communities at that time. Most that were returned were completed in a cursory fashion, simply stating that the community didn't educate on race or engage in activities with Black and Asian groups, with one saying that the problem seems remote for the average congregant. The Zionist Federation said that it employed 2 Asian workers and thus could not be considered prejudiced, while St. John's Wood Synagogue claimed that most of these problems do not arise in this district, illustrating the tendency for Jews to vacate the inner city in favour of more prosperous and less diverse suburbs. There were also a few prejudice responses, such as that from Ernest Krauss of the Sheffield and District Jewish Representative Council. Krauss sought to connect Britain and Israel, suggesting that they both faced the threat of losing their ethnic character. He said, "This liberty-loving country, whose future we seem to be generously giving away to the blacks, I would not support for a single moment to turn Israel into a binational state. Cannot we sympathise with an Englishman wanting to defend his home?" Krauss's comments demonstrates that the ideology of Enoch Powell gained an appeal for at least some Jews in this period. The outcome of the board's process was the publication Improving Race Relations, a Jewish Contribution. The report began by referencing anti-Jewish statements in Parliament in the early 20th century, and, without giving actual examples, argued that similarly misleading allegations against Black and Asian immigrants in the present needed to be challenged. The report then sought to gloss over the poor response to the questionnaires, saying that while Jewish efforts as a whole left room for improvement, it was gratifying to note that many constructive activities were being undertaken. A section entitled "The Lessons of Jewish Immigration and Integration in the UK" offered the Jewish community as a model for others. It implicitly suggested that Jews had faced a more difficult task when they had arrived, by saying there was no social security, very different to conditions prevailing now. The report alluded to the improved position of Jews by the 1960s, saying, "We are not suggesting that at this time Jews suffer to any great extent." And the report alluded to the Board of Deputies lobbying for the Race Relations Act in Parliament, although this was actually quite limited. 2 pages out of 18 were devoted to anti-Semitism among some coloured people, with a report going on to suggest that this might have prevented some Jews from making an active commitment to racial equality, but saying that its existence shouldn't deter the Jewish community from fighting discrimination and prejudice, whatever its source and whoever its victims. The report's recommendations were fairly thin. It stated that the primary task for the Jewish community was to educate itself, though it didn't specify what the community should educate itself on. It called for a variety of measures: special sermons, lectures on race relations in Jewish organisations, work in schools, students volunteering for immigrant youth clubs, and language classes and grants to race relations organisations. But there was no monitoring and no specific organisation set up to encourage such activity, and as a result, little of this was realised. The proposed race relations Sabbath did happen, but only a handful of Reform and Liberal rabbis gave sermons on the suggested theme. The report contained a revealing photograph of two children, a black boy giving money to a white, presumably Jewish, girl, with neither looking at the other. It's revealing of much of the report's attitudes in that, you can see the caption, natural friendship, and it's about giving subs. A club member pays his subs. So, while seeking to portray interracial cooperation, it demonstrates a paternalistic approach that is typical of the period, one in which Jews, like other white people, are in the position of providing help and services, with blacks and Asians as the grateful recipients, and without any real cultural exchange taking place. I'm just going to end the screen while I continue. The overall tone of the report was caution, coupled with a lack of clarity about what it was for. It seems to have been primarily motivated by the need for the Jewish community to be seen to say something about the subject, and then to try and be as non-controversial as possible. It is unclear in what capacity British Jews were supposed to be speaking. As a fellow ethnic group? As a religious sect? With moral lessons to offer? As a subset of white Britain? Or, as most likely, a community that saw itself as having once been an ethnic group, but had now graduated to the status of non-conformist denomination, like Methodists or Quakers. Thus, connections were made between the Jewish past and the black and Asian present, while avoiding any comparison with the Jews of the present day. Throughout the report, race is portrayed as something that refers to others. The race problem is between white Britons, seemingly including Jews, and coloured immigrants from the Caribbean and from Asia. A major omission here was non-white Jews. While there were only a handful of Jews with sub-Saharan African heritage in Britain in the 1960s, there were many more Jews from the Middle East and North Africa and Asia who came to Britain in the post-war decades, particularly Iraqi, Indian and Adenese Jews. The position of these Mizrahi Jews was not taken into account by the board, in part because they represented a very small proportion of the British Jewish community, but also because their identities interrupted the neat story the board sought to tell, in which Jews were to be portrayed as unambiguously white, and in a completely different social category to blacks and Asians. The report was sent out to non-Jewish voluntary social organisations across Britain, seemingly evincing a positive response, but it received far less attention in the Jewish community. Jewish Chronicle editor William Frankel complained that the mountain had laboured only to produce a mouse. Frankel had a point. The board had managed to find out little about attitudes to race within the Jewish community, and if it had found out anything, it was that much of the Jewish community didn't see race relations as having anything to do with them. The report was more often quoted in retrospect, being mentioned well into the 1980s as an example that the board could draw upon to show that it had taken action on issues of race. To conclude, if British Jews had, by the late 1960s, become ordinary, or, to put it in the language of critical race studies, become predominantly seen as white, this was in part due to the new focus on race relations since the late 1950s. Britain had found new others to define the British national identity against, and Jews who had increasingly accepted a Jewish identity that took place behind closed doors were far less of a threat. Jews became ordinary in part due to the newfound societal focus on the extraordinariness of blacks and Asians. By issuing their report, the board sought to define the British Jewish community as an authority on race, rather than a race to be written about. Part of the majority that talked about race, rather than the immigrant minority that was subject to it. Later, in the 1980s, some British Jews would begin to emphasise Jewish otherness and history of oppression as a response to new forms of identity politics and discourses of decolonization in relation to Israel-Palestine. But in the 1950s and 60s, the organized Jewish community used a more conservative strategy, aiming to position Jews firmly on the white side of the race relations debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that talk, Joseph. That was great. And the screen sharing, again, worked really well. And it was great to see the visual materials as well. And I think there's some really interesting conclusions there. And yeah, thanks for everyone for the congratulations as well. It's good to see for both speakers. So I suppose then maybe we can move on to questions now. And I'm looking at the screen chat and I can see there's quite a few questions actually, some addressed to each speaker. So what I think I'll maybe do is maybe take these now. Maybe we can start with Verity, perhaps, and then move on to Joseph. And I could take maybe a few questions for each to start with. And then maybe once we've done that, we can have a second round of questions. I'm sure there's going to be time because we've got nearly 40 minutes. So that should be totally ample to do that technique, that strategy. So maybe then to start with then. So here's a question then from Claire Lafole to Verity. Does the Bachad history stop in 1948? Or is there a network of former Bachad members still active and perpetuating its ideology or memory?
Yes, good question. As I mentioned briefly, that I hadn't had time to go into what happened later. And there is a lot that happened after the war and in the 50s and 60s. Because Bachad was a specifically hakshara, or training through these farms to get youngsters to Israel or Palestine, that was its sort of raison d'etre, really. So once that need had passed, which it sort of hung on to this role until 1962, actually, when they sold the farm at Thaxted. In name, there was what was called the Bachad Fellowship, which actually still exists in name today. Within B'nai Akiva, it's actually what has become in effect the Friends of B'nai Akiva. And this is where the sort of fluid boundaries between organizations become a little confusing. So once what happened in the 50s was that living standards went up, and so did the expectations of many young Jews. Rather than go and train for agriculture on a farm, they would much rather go to university. There were quite a few battles between Bachad leaders and individuals who wanted to pursue higher education, which is interesting. So by the late 50s, they were struggling to get recruits for the farms. And it was also very financially not terribly feasible to keep the farm running at Thaxted. So yes, so after that, B'nai Akiva sort of took over the role of youth work, and by the late 50s, you could be trained for agriculture in Israel itself. You didn't have to be trained first in England. So people who went on Aliyah to kibbutzim would go straight there rather than through Bachad. I hope does that answer the question, Claire? Good.
All right, thank you. Thanks for the answer too. Okay, so we've got another question. This is actually to both speakers, and this is from Tony Stoller. Have Verity and or Joe reached any conclusions about the validity or otherwise for the concept of intergenerational trauma transfer? And that question is something you can both have a go at.
Okay, should I go first? It's a really, really interesting area. I would love to sort of get into that, but sadly, I don't think there'll be room for it in my thesis. I'm sure it is present, and there's different ways in which perhaps it manifests itself. One of which maybe, and I'd have to interview the children and grandchildren of Bachad members, is the sometimes quite extreme reaction to the religious side. Some have gone very, very ultra-Orthodox, and I'd love to explore the relationship between that and this intergenerational trauma transfer, perhaps. And on the opposite end of the scale, you've got some who have completely left any sort of desire to keep their religion. So that's a particular connection I would be very interested to explore in the future.
I mean, it's not a specific focus of my research, but I think that later periods, which I didn't talk about today, but the 70s and 80s, where there's sort of rise in Jewish ethnic consciousness and maybe a sort of a critique of that, or an attempt to row back on that move towards whiteness, towards a sort of Jewish ethnic specific identity, I think is influenced by Holocaust consciousness of the second generation and growth of Holocaust consciousness awareness in Britain. And it's also influenced by Zionism and popular Zionism. I see that was one of the questions. So I'll just hold back for a moment on that.
Great, thank you both.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that question. Really interesting, and thanks for both speakers for answering it as well. So we've got a few more questions then in the chat. I'll go through these one by one because there's lots of time, and then maybe we can come to maybe some more questions at the end. There's a bit of time, if people want to chip in orally at the end, I'm sure that'll be okay, as long as you make it clear to me and the speakers who you are and obviously and what your question is. But just to pick up these few in the chat then. So this is from Yuri, and this is Yuri Agnon, and this is to Joseph. Is there any indication that the 1967 war has had an effect, and what effect, on the discourse of the late 1960s?
So, I mean, there's a scholar, Jamie Hakim, wrote a PhD thesis on what he called popular Zionism in Britain in the wake of the 67 war. And there's an academic article based on it. And he basically argues there was a sort of almost a physical change many British Jews went through. Partly because in the run-up to the Six-Day War, it seemed the perception would be that it might be a second Holocaust. This is how it was viewed, that Israel might be destroyed, and this was very swiftly replaced by jubilation when Israel won the war in such a short time. So I do think this has a big impact, but I think there's sort of in my research there's two things going on at the same time. That there's a kind of British Jews seeking the sort of social position of what I call whiteness, or the kind of being a nonconformist denomination and wanting to get out of the box of race, and at the same time a Jewish sort of ethnic consciousness which grows, and a kind of rejection of past assimilationist and the kind of old assimilationist old guard of Anglo Jewry, the kind of so-called cousinhood of the past. And I kind of think that in the 80s they kind of, and the 90s really, there's a kind of, the term ethnic minority gets kind of used quite helpfully. It's a kind of a new discourse that kind of moves beyond race, and hopefully the kind of the difficulties posed by that, while acknowledging this kind of new Jewish national consciousness. So I do think it's very important, but I think in a way it doesn't become important in the Jewish conversation. It takes a while to feed through. I think it's not until the 70s and 80s that really makes a difference.
Super interesting. Can I just follow up on that?
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
So one of the quotes that you gave, I don't remember the name of the person, but was a somewhat problematic quote about protecting the home and thinking of Britishness as whiteness and something to do with Israel, like with Israel as, a metaphor. And I wonder how much that happens and how much that is related to the change that Palestinians have after 1967 of being under Israeli control, and like both Palestinians in the Green Line and outside of the Green Line changing their position with Israel. And I wonder if that has an effect on that metaphor. Or maybe people didn't look at it in that sort of detail.
I mean, he was quite extreme case, and I put it in because it's a provocative quote. But the discourse is still around. Like Richard Spencer, as a sort of American far right figure a few years ago, used precisely this argument, right, that Israel would practice sort of ethnocracy. Really, why shouldn't America do the same? And Krauss is saying the same about Britain. There's no doubt that there was a question that had to be dealt with by progressive activists, that sort of racial equality agenda they were pushing in Britain was in contrast with the ethnic discrimination in Israel. And those that supported some degree of ethnic discrimination in Britain sometimes did link that to their Zionism. I mean, I'm thinking of Alfred Sherman, for example. There's a variety of Keith Joseph, variety of right-wing conservative figures in the 1970s and 80s that do this. So it's a discourse. I mean, it's not the majority, but it's there.
Thank you.
Okay, great, and thanks for that. Thanks for the interesting dialogue as well. So I think there's one more question in the chat, and this is for Joseph as well. And this is from Kat Gardner. Just to say also, if you want to write more questions in the chat, anyone who's here, you're very welcome to do so. So this is from Kat Gardner to Joseph. In another talk I was at, it suggested that CARE, C-A-R-E, was an area where Jews and Black people came together, campaigned for race equality. Any ideas or research on this?
So, Kat, I'm going to guess this was an Edie Friedman talk recently. I'm going to guess, but it could be wrong.
Yeah, I don't know.
Anyway,
was it?
I'm not sure. Kat can speak in a minute, but I think you're referring to CARD, which was the campaign against racial discrimination, which was a 1960s organisation that attempted to be a bit like the American civil rights organizations in creating this broad multiracial coalition to fight for legislation against racial discrimination. And it's very interesting because there were a number of prominent Jews involved in it, and Anthony Lester is one. I think Eric Rose, possibly of Institute of Race Relations, is also one. And a sort of small group, but they're important. And CARD kind of falls apart because of an internal argument about who really should be in control. And there's a kind of an idea that it should become Black-led, and it should be led by Black and Asian people. And they basically throw the white people off the leadership, and the Jews kind of are part of that group that are no longer in the leadership of CARD. So yes, there's a moment, but it doesn't last that long. And the same thing happens at the Institute for Race Relations. There's a sort of internal power grab led by Sivanandan, the librarian, and most of the old guard Jewish liberals that were part of the board are no longer on the board after that. So there's a brief moment of partnership there.
It was actually in something which just came out yesterday, very non-academic, but it's very interesting, called Black Woman's Hour. Can send you the link. And it was actually something anecdotal, someone saying that their parents were very involved in CARD, as you say it is, during the 60s, and campaigned together with Jewish people. And she remembered, her memory of that from her parents was of Jewish people and Black people working together in that era. It's one of those sort of lost moments and not known about moments of history. And as you said, there's this focus so much on the States, which is part of what you're doing. We don't really know what that went on.
I think I'm just trying to suggest there's different stories everywhere. There's a specific story in the Caribbean, there's a specific story in South Africa, and a specific story in Britain. You can't just kind of tie them all under the same kind of Black Jewish relations banner. You need to look at the specific histories in those places. Thanks, Kat. I'm aware of that program, and I'll give it a listen in the next few days. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. And also the comment, really interesting, can't wait to hear more. Also from Kat, here's a question from Tony Kushner, and this is for Verity. Does Bachad fit more neatly into a transnational or a diaspora model, or both?
Yes, thank you, Tony. This is the sort of million-dollar question, which I'm struggling with and will do over the next year. But I think it leans more towards the diaspora, but the diaspora with which it is involved is transnational. So this tension. So I think the answer is both. And I've yet to really divine the theoretical literature in both those areas to proceed and progress further with that question.
Okay. All right. I'm looking through the chat. Are there any other questions at the moment, or any other issues anyone would like to raise who's listening in? You could use the raise hand feature if you wanted. Having a look. I think I got onto all of the questions in the chat. I don't think there's anything that I haven't covered that people have actually written in, but we do have a bit of time. I mean, I think because we've had two speakers, I think we can finish before 7:30, but there is definitely time if anyone else does want to ask any questions or follow anything up, maybe. There's definitely time to do that, and that'd be totally fine, totally great. Oh, there's a new question. And this is from Adrian Leibovitz. Did the BOD make any intervention on the question of South African apartheid in the 1970s? You don't have to be sorry for the question, it's not too late.
Really good question, Adrian. I don't think they made a substantive intervention. I don't want to say definitively in case I've missed it. I don't think they did. In the 80s, certainly, they were keen to be... I think they kind of played a balancing act. They wanted to be seen as on the right side, but not necessarily be too active about it. So I think it was a kind of case of kind of well-meaning statements without that much involvement. And there was a more activist Jews Against Apartheid group in the 1980s, which was led by two Indian Jews, actually. And that was much more of a sort of left activist group. I think I don't want to be unfair to the board. I do think they were against apartheid, but I think it was a fairly sort of calm opposition without that much involvement. That's about as much I'm able to say right now.
Thank you. It's helpful.
Okay, thanks for that question, Adrian. Thank you very much. We've got another question, and this is from Anushka Alexander Rose. Hi, Anushka. And this is to Joseph. Speaking of angry young men, have you looked into the work of Harold Pinter on this theme?
No, thanks, Anushka, I haven't. It would be a really good study, though. And I think, just to say, I included a bit of culture here just to give a bit of breadth. It's not a literary PhD, and there's a kind of, as I said at the beginning, it's something that seems niche kind of opens up, and there's I think a huge amount more one could do. I hope to do a bit more about television sitcoms, such as Never Mind the Quality, Feel the Width, the late 60s comedy, and also my favorite 1990s sitcom, So Haunt Me, with Miriam Carlin. Try and get those in. I haven't got I haven't done any work on Pinter, so I'm just going to admit that and let others offer thoughts. If you want to offer any thoughts on that, Anushka, then do. I haven't got any.
I just think he's, out of the angry young men, his depiction of like the Jewish theme is so idiosyncratic and kind of strange, and it's completely at odds from like the Jewish community itself, that it would be interesting if there was anything that discussed race in it, because it's such a bizarre depiction of Jews. But I just, because you mentioned.
No, good point. No, thank you. Thank you.
All right, thanks for that, Anushka. Great. We've had quite a nice balance of questions, really, to both speakers, which has been very nice. I wonder if anyone's generally got any questions for both speakers, or any particular comments they'd like to come back on. You can use the chat to write in if you've got any final thoughts or reflections.
Tony just posted one for Verity.
Oh.
Yes. Tony Kushner to Verity. Did any of your Bachad people end up staying in the UK? And if so, what happened to them?
Yes, the answer is yes, they did. I'm still collecting the data to allow me to sort of definitively say, or nearly definitively say, what proportion stayed and what proportion went and where. It wasn't just to Palestine, Israel that they went. Some went to the States or South America even. But the ones who stayed here, it was usually for family reasons, or some of them, yes, they had elderly parents who, if they were lucky enough to have any elderly parents to look after. Other people, married people who didn't want to go on Aliyah. Some were ill, sadly. One actually died in active service in the war. So a multitude of different reasons. I'm in touch with a few second generation in this category, and hope to sort of learn a bit more about the sort of, motivations and reasons for not going. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay. There's yet another question has come in, which is great. Helen, to everyone, it's written in the chat for everyone. Well, it's a general question to both speakers. How are you managing your research in the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think all scholars are struggling in all sorts of different ways. And when I've got a small toddler, for large parts of the time she's been at home, and that's been challenging. And archives are a real problem because many of them are closed at the moment, and even when some were open, others were closed. So it's been actually quite challenging. And I think, in common with many PhD scholars, my research is going to go on a little longer than it otherwise would have done, because we can only do so much online. For me, the Board Deputies Archives in the London Metropolitan Archives are a really crucial source, and I need to consult that they haven't been scanned. So I need to get back to that as soon as possible, really. So yeah, it's a problem.
Mm.
Yes, and I, as I said in my talk, I was very fortunate to be able to go in 2019 for a large chunk of time to Israel, and came back with hundreds of documents, which I'm still ploughing through, lots in German and Dutch and Hebrew. So it's a challenge. So in a way, the lockdown has, one doesn't wish for lockdowns at all, but it wouldn't have made much difference to my lifestyle because I'll be busy anyway. So, yes, I will want to be doing a few more, a few more interviews, and because of the COVID situation, we have to reapply for our ethics applications to be able to conduct interviews via Zoom or, Microsoft Teams, etc. So I'm in the middle of that at the moment.
Okay, thanks for that. Really, really interesting responses and a very good question. I suppose everyone here is struggling a bit with this one, aren't they? And I suppose it does depend slightly on what your topic is and the accessibility of like digitized material, which seems to vary hugely from country to country and also from topic to topic. I wonder if anyone's got any other kind of thoughts or questions. I had a few kind of, my exhortation has worked quite well. Does anyone else want to say anything? Don't think I've missed anything in the chat. No?
I think we probably can.
Yeah, maybe time to wrap up then. I've given a few opportunities for any kind of final questions or reflections now. I suppose what we really should do is thank our two speakers for really great talks and also for answering the questions in great depth as well. So yeah, thank you very much. And you can put a little hand clap function, I think, on reactions like this.
Thank you.
Okay, great. All right, well, thank you very much, both our speakers. And also thank you to everyone for attending. And thanks to those who asked questions and engaged as well in the chat and in person, I suppose. Maybe that's not the right phrase. But yeah, great. Thanks for coming. Good to see you, good attendance. And yeah, been a success, I think.